Yeah, Craig, let's talk about the fact that these documents, let's say we were non-Christians, okay? If you're a history major, if you're looking at ancient documents, sources rule. Earliest ones basically win, okay? Now, what's happening today in these specials, the ones that we watched that you were on, and also the ones that are coming out and so on, the thing is these specials are taking the Gnostic writings of 200 years after Christ, and they're trying to get parts of it back as close to the apostles' writing as they can. And then they're taking the New Testament documents. You got 9 sources. You got Matthew, you got Mark, you got Luke, you got John, you got Paul, you got Jude, you got Peter, and the writer of Hebrews, and who am I leaving out? One more. The fact is these sources, 9 sources that are all written before, say, the first century is over, okay? In fact, tell us about these sources and how you would date them and why they are our best sources, and if you're a non-Christian just listening to this conversation, that you go to these sources for your information about Jesus and why it's accurate information.
I quite agree, John. There's you might even call it a stealth scholarship at work. And I found it so frustrating in my involvement in the National Geographic program that investigated the Gospel of Judas. Now, I think National Geographic did a great job, and they were very fair to me. But what I noticed in some of the other participants was this tendency to take what clearly are 2nd century, if not later, sources and sneak them into an earlier period to try to get the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, maybe even the Gospel of Judas also, and smuggle those later documents as close to the end of the 1st century as possible, and then you will hear them in reference to the New Testament Gospels and other New Testament writings doing just the opposite, pushing them further away as close to the end of the 1st century, maybe in some cases even into the beginning of the 2nd century, so that they can then speak very loosely of early Christian writings or early Christianity. And then that is the backdrop to comments like diversity in early Christianity, as if to say the diversity, which is clearly attested in these 2nd century documents, as if all that is going on at about the same time. And so when Mark writes his gospel, or Matthew writes his gospel, or when Paul writes his letters, it's all sort of happening in the same generation. And we've got this great big diversity, and it just so happens one stream won out. But is it any better than the other streams? Oh, who knows? And that's the part about it that I find frustrating. And frankly, it's not critical discipline scholarship. It's something else.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, let's push Paul back to almost the time of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15. And I want you to show us how it's done. And we need to tell people what the evidence is. We'll talk about that when we come right back. All right, we're back. We're talking about some of the most popular books that are out today, that specials are being done on television, including the Da Vinci Code and the Jesus Dynasty, the Judas Papers and Jesus Papers and Misquoting Jesus. These books, there's something that we as Christians look at these books and we say, you know, we got a hard time. Talk to me about why 1 Corinthians 15, which is Paul's account, goes back almost to Jesus himself.
Right. What we have in Paul, and you mentioned in the last segment, when you're doing historiography, probably no principles are more important than early testimony and authoritative testimony. People who are in the right time and the right place to report what they report. And 1 Corinthians 15 is arguably, I would say, the central text in present discussions on these subjects. And the reason is this. If we start with the cross at approximately 30 AD, if we call that ground zero, and before the Gospels, before the earliest Gospel, 1 Corinthians checks in at about 55 AD, plus or minus, whether conservative, whatever the writer, conservative, not conservative, we have 25 years. Now, I'll just stop right there and I'd say in ancient historiography, this is incredible. In a time when the best-known biography of Alexander the Great, that of Plutarch, is almost 400 years after Plutarch, when we learn from the early Caesars, from Tacitus and Suetonius, and a good gap is 100 years, 25 is incredible. From a person, Paul, which you're going to look hard to find a critic who says who doesn't admit that Paul believed he saw the risen Jesus. And here you have him writing this account and giving a report, which he says in 1 Corinthians 15:3, I'm passing on to you as of first importance that which I also received. Well, wait a minute. If the cross is ground zero and 1 Corinthians 15 is a mere 25 years later, Paul said in the first 2 verses of that chapter, he's writing it here, but he said, I proclaimed this to you when I came. When did he go to Corinth? A few years earlier, perhaps 51. Now we're at plus 21, but here's the key. Paul said, I gave you what I was given. And being an apostle, we have to at least give Paul credit, having done rabbinic research. At least he believes that these came from good sources. Well, in fact, contemporary scholarship, almost everyone who answers this question believes that Paul received this material, actually Galatians 1:18, they believe that Paul received this material when he went to Jerusalem about 5 years after the cross. Some put it as early as 3, like Gerrit Ludemann, and as late as 8. That's the range. So average of about 5 years. And Paul does the math for you. Here's the cross. If he comes to Christ in his trip to Damascus, perhaps at plus 2, 3 years later he's in Jerusalem, 2 plus 3. Some might move it up or back. But he's in Jerusalem. He's with Peter and James. He spends 15 days with them. I love C.H. Dodd's comment. They spent 15 days together, and it's safe to say that they did more than talk about the weather.